Welcome back to the second series of Tokyo College's The Salon that we started last autumn. So Professor John Lee, who was visiting Tokyo College at the time, and I started this series. And this series, the second one, involves me as the host, and we have three professors that we have invited as guests to this salon. And I am Naoko Shimazu, and professor at Tokyo College, and I'm a global historian of Asia, but obviously with a lot of interest in other professors' research. So I'm very, very delighted to be back to host this series this season. Now, for those of you who are new to this Tokyo College's Salon, please check the Tokyo College's YouTube site, because we do have recordings of the previous speakers or guests that we had last autumn. Now, I just want to briefly introduce today's guest, Professor Hiroshi Ishida, who is a very distinguished professor, emeritus professor, but he is also currently a special professor, 特別教授?
It's called university professor in English.
University professor is the proper title in English. And he continues at the Institute of Social Science within the University of Tokyo. And he is a sociologist, and I suppose your area would be comparative social contemporary societies with a particular sort of research focus on comparative social stratification. But Professor Ishida has spent at least 10 years, if not more, outside of Japan during his period of training. And he was at Harvard University doing his MA, and then he was at Oxford University, St. Antony's College and Nuffield College, Oxford, between 1985 to 1988. And then he completed his PhD at Harvard in 1986. And then he became professor or associate professor at Columbia University's Department of Sociology. And then he went on to spend quite a few years at Columbia until 1995, when he started at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo as associate professor. So, welcome to the second series, and this is supposed to be a conversational series to find out about the sort of more the human side of these prominent, distinguished professors. So, I want to start by asking you about your more than 10 years of experience in the West. How did that sort of form you or influence you as an academic? And what was your transition like coming back to Japan after so many years abroad?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to actually thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk here. And I'm very pleased that the host is Shimazu sensei, because we kind of go back many years.
Yes, we do.
I'll ask a question later. But,
okay.
So you first asked me to sort of talk about briefly my sort of early careers in the U.S. and England. As before going to graduate school, I did go to undergraduate schools both in the United States and Japan, and then my graduate training is in the United States. I think I benefit a lot by going to American graduate school, because they have a very structured and systematic training. So you feel like you learn about the basic sort of methodology and theory about your discipline. And the first 3 years, you'll take courses and have comprehensive exams and thesis prospectus. And it's very much structured. And then I think I benefit a great deal from the systematic training, which was not, I think, so available in the Japanese setting. And for that matter, the British system is a little bit more like a Japanese system that you treat your graduate students as a kind of adults and then do your own work kind of thing. So it was good that I made choice to go to graduate school in the United States. And so after 3 years, you're kind of start working on your own dissertation, and then that's when you're kind of becoming more independent. And then I should say that I benefit greatly from my colleague students because unless your supervisor is seriously interested in your topic, you're basically on your own. So we had a sort of voluntary study group to share ideas and present our own work while we were writing thesis. And Professor John Lee, who started this Salon.
Yes.
With you, he was with me as a graduate student. So we had a sort of a study group together. So those people helped me a great deal to go through the graduate training, and that's probably one of the biggest assets I have in terms of having intellectual input as well as a long-term sort of friendship and relationship. And then I moved to Oxford for my postdoc at St. Anthony's and Nuffield College. These are the social science colleges that exist in Oxford. Oxford had how many colleges?
At that time, I think it was 37 or something.
37?
Yes,
Okay.
I think it's more now.
Okay. And then you were at the modeling in
Yes,
college.
I was.
Yes. So that's where we met the first time.
Yeah, I think it was 1986 when we met.
Okay.
So it was quite a long time ago.
Yeah, that's quite a long time ago. Yes.
Yeah. And like I was a master's student.
Yes.
Doing international relations, and I think you were already a postdoc.
Yeah, I completed sort of yes. When I first moved to Oxford, I haven't completed my thesis, but yes, after several months I did. So I basically spent at Oxford as a postdoc, right? Yeah.
Yes, because I still remember the time, exact moment that I met you, and I kind of felt, wow, this sort of, to me, very senior, researcher, because I was an MPhil student, so I kind of thought, yes, wow, yes, and he came from Japan and all sorts of things. But Oxford was a really interesting place, wasn't it, in terms of different kind of research experience training that you get, because Oxford's training method at the time was basically no training. They sort of throw you into the deep end.
I see.
And you basically had to find ways to survive.
I see.
And I actually, at that time, everybody was like that at Oxford. So I didn't know any other way, So I didn't really feel that I was, sort of suffering so much. It was very hard. It was a very hard system to get used to. But I think it's that survival thing, that if you can survive that, then you're going to be all right,
Okay. That sounds like a very harsh system.
It wasn't easy. Yeah. So tell me, why did you decide to study sociology?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah,
I did decide to study sociology before entering college. Let's see. I was a bit of how should I say it? I come from a sort of intellectual family in the sense that my father was a professor as well, and then there are a lot of books at home. So I had a kind of cultural capital in that sense. And so I did have a chance to read quite a few, because my father was also in social sciences, quite a few books. And one of the scholars that I read and attracted was Max Weber, who was a sociologist, German sociologist. And that's part of the reason, I guess, why I was interested in sociology. And I did study sociology as an undergrad, and then when I went to United States, I had a chance to sort of study quantitative kind of analysis, using the large-scale data set to quantitatively analyze the data. And that was also very attractive. I never had chance to do such kind of work. So that's why I decided to stay on in the States to go on to graduate school because I was very attracted to that training. And and then going to Oxford, I think being a postdoc is one of the most luxurious moments of one's life, that you don't have to teach, but you can basically do your own research. And I was at the social science college, and so there are sociologists, political scientists, economists, basically, and there are very lively sort of cross-disciplinary exchanges. And I was very happy, and that's probably one of the happiest moments of my life. And so I had a very good time as a postdoc. And then after finishing up the postdoc, I tried to find positions in either a country where I can teach in English or Japanese. So I did try to find jobs in England, United States, Canada, and also Japan. But I ended up having offers from the States. I didn't have any other offers, except I had an offer from Canada, Canadian University, but not from Japan. So maybe I should tell a little bit about that. I guess in England too, but also in the United States, if they decide to bring you in, they'll pay the airfares and you put you in the hotel, and then you're asked to do lectures or mock teaching, and then you have a sort of an interview with the individual faculty every 30 minutes. That's usually a very typical case. Usually it's 1.5 or 2 day visit. In Japan, you suddenly get your letter saying that next week on this date at 1 p.m. or something, you're having an interview for an hour. That's it. So then you have to arrange everything. You pay your own expense and go there, and then sit there and interview. And maybe I'm not going to tell you which university.
It was.
So at the interview, it was a pretty long interview, probably an hour or an hour and a half. In the middle of the interview, he said, "Well, it's getting a bit tired, so let's take a break." Okay, that's good. Okay, that's good. So the secretary of the department brings in a tea, and then they serve the tea in front of those professors, like 15 of them, and there was no tea in front of me. Isn't it interesting?
Very
and
interesting.
They have tea, and they say, "Okay, let's start." Okay.
Oh, I see.
I didn't get the job. So yes. It was a very sort of interesting, cultural sort of experience I had. So I ended up going back to the States for my teaching, and I taught there for several years, and I got tenure, fortunately. So I could stay in the United States if I want. But the reasons for going back is that because I was away from the country for many years, actually more than 10 years, and I would like to actually look at the society, because I do work on Japan from a comparative angle. I wanted to look at the society from within. That was probably the main reason. The second reason was that the Institute of Social Science, where I'm in, this is a research institute, so we don't have to teach undergraduates. We teach graduate students. So that was also attractive in terms of research orientation. And then the third reason is that the institute had a really nice data kind of archive in the library. They had documents from the 1950s and then 60s that I was interested in. So I will have good access to these materials if I come back. And finally, it gave me incentive to conduct original surveys in Japan, because being outside Japan, it's very hard to conduct your own original surveys. So those are the reasons that why I wanted to come back, and also my family reasons too. That my families were still in Tokyo. So I ended up coming back, and then I think it was a good choice. You never know. It's always what if.
Yes, exactly.
So I can't tell. But I was very happy that I came back. But I always had planned ahead for like 5 or 6 years, but not in a longer term. So I did have chances to go back to the States, and then I thought about whether I should or not. But I ended up staying in Japan, and that was also a good decision, I think. So because the arrangement I had was very good, and I was very satisfied with the research setting that I had.
So could I just ask you about when you returned to Japan after 12 years or so at Harvard, Oxford, Columbia? How did you find the Japanese academic world of sociology? Was it sort of I think the question is basically about to what extent was the field of sociology kind of integrated into the global academic community, or was there a distinctly Japanese kind of way of doing sociology when you came back that you kind of noticed in particular?
Yeah, well, certainly Japanese sociology is not a global sort of discipline in a sense that they have their own sort of training, and then they have their own networks. And then Japanese Sociological Society has a long history. It has some relationship with international organizations. And then, in fact, the survey that I use for my work was conducted in 1955. It was the first survey was conducted in 1955. And that was sort of a collaborative effort between Japanese sociologists and sociologists and the International Sociological Association. So there were some people who were sort of international minded or going outside of Japan to do some collaborative work. But certainly that was a very small minority. And then also the academic orientation of the discipline is that more about, let's say, theory, historical studies, or maybe a little bit of cultural studies, but not much of the quantitative studies that the kind that I was doing. So that was actually one of the reasons why I decided to go to the United States for training. But when I came back, I think things are changing a little bit, that there are some group of people who are actually seriously doing work in terms of quantitative and using a large-scale social surveys. So there were some changes, but there were certainly not a majority. And then still I would say that quantitatively oriented researchers are not the majority in the Japanese sociology discipline. Unlike probably the United States, there are more of those kind of people, regardless of whether it's good or bad. That's I think probably adequate characterization of the discipline, and that's fine with me. I mean, and people in Japan, I think I'm one of the very few who came back to Japan after having a permanent position outside, and then came back as a professor. Usually some people go abroad and get training and then come back for their first jobs. Not many people had kind of tenure job and then come back. So I got the sense that sociologists in Japan did not know how to sort of treat me, in a sense. So I was not involved in the Japanese Sociological Association, Sociological Society, the national organization. I have very few sort of relationship with them, which is fine. And so I was very in a sense, it was a kind of odd person in terms of career-wise. It was unusual, at least in sociology. In economics, it's not an unusual path. People do get training abroad, get jobs, and then come back. That's a path that the economists, some of the economists have, but not in sociology. So still now, I think very few people.
Oh, really?
Who had permanent job and then coming back to Japan. It's very unusual.
So could I, because I know that you've mentioned this big social survey that you've been involved with, and it's been a very important part of, I guess, Japanese database building. And is it the one that's called Social Stratification and Social Mobility Survey?
Yes.
And it happens every 10 years, doesn't it?
Right.
And so could you kind of tell us a bit about this? Because it's a really interesting survey with so many important data over the years. Because it's still going on, isn't it?
Yes.
Could next year be the 2025, be another?
Yeah, there's a plan to conduct a survey in 2025. Yeah. Well, thanks for asking that question, because that's, as you said, a very important data source available in Japan. It's also original. Doing a cross-sectional studies every 10 years, periodically, I don't think that happened in any other countries that I know of. I specifically focus upon social stratification. So it is unique in a sense that, as I said, in 1955 survey is done in collaboration with foreign international scholars, because there were similar surveys conducted in other countries. So the sociologists then wanted to conduct a similar survey in Japan. That was the sort of initial idea. And since then, they did this every 10 years, periodically. And it's a group of people, and every group, they'll try to get fundings from the Ministry of Education. And then so far, we've been able to do it for every 10 years very successfully. And I was involved in 95, 2005, and 2015. And I'm not involved in the most recent 2025, but it has been a very, certainly a beneficial experience for me. And the unique sort of character of this survey is that it asks questions about your social positions, basically, occupations, education, income, or these questions. And also it has a question about your background, that is your father's occupation or father's education, so that you can look at it intergenerationally. The father's generation and your own respondent's generation. You can look at the changes in occupation or education. And also it asks questions about your career trajectory. So you ask questions about your first job, your second job, and up to your current job. So you have an entire job history about or social positions across your life course. So that's a very rich source of information. And that kind of questions are repeated every 10 years. So we can look at the career patterns among men, let's say, and then changes between 1955 and 2005, for example. You can ask those questions using the data source. So it's a very unique and precious, I think, data sources. And
so what's the pool of informants? I mean, how many people get involved in this in terms of, I suppose you go and interview them, or do you send out survey forms?
You interview them. And then you have a questionnaire, and then you construct the questionnaires, and then you interview them in person. And usually it's a nationally representative sample of people who are 20 to 69. The last 2015 survey extended to include older people. But it's basically 20 to 69 is the age range. So you have a wide range of people to be interviewed. And men and women since 1985. Before then, there were only men were included, but after 1985, there were women were also the respondents.
So do you include children? No. So they're
20
adults.
to 69 adults.
20, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what, you interview about 2,000, 3,000 people? Or I don't know
it
what the
depends
scale.
on the survey. It
see.
varies, about 3,000 people is a rough kind of, yes.
So do you do any kind of longitudinal study, like you go back to the same people to interview
I see.
once a decade, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, this is what is called repeated cross-sectional survey. So every year, let's say 2005, you sample the new people. And then 2015, you sample different people. So it's not a longitudinal in a sense that follow up the same people. But yes. So we retrospectively ask questions about people's career instead of following up people's career.
Yeah.
So there are sort of two ways to get information about careers. One is retrospectively, and the other one is to follow them up. That is prospectively. And that's a very good question. Because more recently, the surveys are geared towards following up people. These are what called longitudinal panel surveys.
So you go like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then that's, in a sense, much better because you can get accurate information. Because retrospective questions, you tend to forget things. And then it's, for example, occupation, it's not so difficult to remember. But the income, for example, it's not so easy. And then also, in terms of subjective questions, you forget what you thought about it 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But if you follow up the same people, then you can ask sort of subjective questions at that time. And then that's a very vivid, so to speak, responses that you can get.
So how is, who uses these data that's been built? I mean, is it used for, I don't know, government policy making, or is it used by, well, I would imagine used by other academics as well, but I just kind of wonder what this kind of holding this kind of really important database means to Japan. What's the kind of utility of this?
Yeah. First of all, it used to be that the data source, data were analyzed by people who collected them. So sort of ownership was those people who had the data set. But more recently, there's a archive of survey data. So it's like a library. You can go to the archive and sort of borrow the data set for analysis. And up to 1996, 97 we started this archive. The institute that I belong to, one of the reasons that I came back, I didn't mention when I said the first time, is that in the United States, or actually in Britain too, there were public archives, the data archives that I can use to have access to U.S. data sources, for example. But in Japan, they're very limited, public sort of access the data set. And the government service as well then, in mid-1990s, it was very much restrictive. So when I came back, one of the things that I want to do was to create this kind of open public archive. So the institute Institute of Social Science, they have surveys collected by the institute. Especially the ones that I'm interested in, was surveys collected in 1950s and 60s, early time. So the first data set that the archive put in was the survey done in 1950s about graduate middle school students. And so it was showing that we have our data set and we're going to put in the public domain. So other people who have the data set should also sort of deposit their data set for public use. And so that was the first sort of attempt to open up the data sources. But nowadays, there are like SSM survey, the Social Stratification and Mobility Survey, 55 to 2015, that is all deposited into that archive. It's called Social Science Japan Data Archive, operated by the Institute of Social Science. So any social scientist can have an access for academic use. So after having the data archive, I think the prospect for using these data sources, sharing these data sources and analyze them, and then sort of doing a kind of policy implications out of this data set, this possibility is just expanded tremendously. So I would say that after this establishment of the data archive, and then also people are start using these data archives, I think the potential for using not only the social stratification mobility surveys, but other important large-scale social data surveys can be shared and analyzed by the academics. And it has, I think, great potentials for contributing to policies as well.
So you've actually published huge amounts of research papers. Well, it does seem quite big to me, and some of which actually it's lined up in the bookcase.
Oh, thank you.
Behind social class in contemporary Japan, social mobility in contemporary Japan, and so on. And I know that you've covered some topics ranging from sort of like marriage prospects, as well as the kind of social mobility of young kids with various social environments in which they grow up. How does that affect their sort of future trajectory and so on. So what was the most surprising finding for you in all these kind of quantitative work that you've done, which was something very unexpected?
Okay, there are quite a few.
Okay, that's good. You can name a few.
I'll just choose a few. I would say that my work can be divided, so to speak. My work on social inequality can be divided into one, looking at more of a macro structure of inequality, and then the second is more looking at micro kind of processes of generating social inequality. Talking about the first kind of macro structure, what I do is I look at the class structure, distribution of how society's class structure evolve, and also how the patterns of intergenerational mobility, that is father to son mobility, has changed or stable, and also ask the question of whether Japan, compared with other industrial nations, stand out in terms of the extent and pattern of intergenerational mobility. So in terms of, very briefly on conclusion, is that if you compare cross-nationally Japan with other industrial nations, you basically arrive at two conclusions. One is, actually, it depends upon what kind of mobility you look at, you arrive at very different conclusions. One type is called relative mobility. Relative mobility means that you compare mobility chances for people coming from different backgrounds. For example, if you compared your mobility chances of, let's say, a son of a doctor, what's his chances of becoming a doctor? Compare with a son of a farmer, his chances of becoming a doctor. And obviously, if there's inequality, then what kind of background or social origin you're coming from have different chances. So that's a relative chances. You compare the chances of mobility between people from different class origin. Then if you compare that cross-nationally, there's a very similar pattern of intergenerational mobility or reproduction across all industrial societies. There's a tendency for class inheritance. People from the same class, people end up in the same class as your father. There's a tendency for that. And there's some barriers to mobility by farming and non-farm. And there's also the hierarchy of classes, and there's a barriers to mobility by hierarchy. So these patterns are observed not only in Japan, but also in most industrial societies. So there's a similarity across. And in terms of the trend, the pattern is very stable across the trend in most nations, including Japan. So that's sort of looking at the relative mobility. And then if you look at absolute mobility is simply the proportion of mobility rates. For example, what proportion of people move out of the father's class? You know, that's the total mobility. And so that proportion is, in Japan, in let's say 1955, the first survey, it was very low. So I think it was like 40% or so. But it goes up very rapidly and stays on about 68%. Or 2/3 of people move out of their father's occupational class. That's a very high rate. And what characterizes Japan is that total mobility rate increased very rapidly in the early stage of industrialization, 1950s and 60s. And the reason is that Japan is, among the industrial nations, Japan is a latecomer. They started industrializing late, but very rapidly. So late but rapid industrialization sort of characterizes economic historical path of Japanese society. Because it started late and changed the class structure very compressed period of time. Compressed period means that within one generation. So people will move from farming sector to urban kind of manual work, and they can eventually go to the urban white-collar work. A society like England, where the industrialization took place very early, in the first generation, they moved from farming to manual work. Okay? And then the next generation, you have manual work to non-manual work. But in Japan, the expansion of the manual sector, manual labor sector, as well as the non-manual sector, took place about the same time. So that is very different path than the early industrializers. So because of that, Japan has a very rapid sort of upward mobility path compared with like a country like England. So these are sort of a difference. You can see the differences in absolute rates between Japan, late industrializers versus the early industrializing countries. So that's a kind of a snapshot of the cross-national sort of comparison in terms of mobility rates.
So would you say that in this age of really growing, older population and the shrinking younger population, that's actually going to change? It must change. Probably a lot of things will change, won't it? In terms of the kind of surveys that this every decade survey would produce. I would imagine there might be some very interesting trends in the next decade or two coming up.
Right. Yeah. Maybe the biggest sort of impact in terms of the trend is the changing class structure, because that determines the sort of a framework of or setting of the mobility. The biggest change in recent period is that shrinkage of the farm sector, and an expansion of the upper non-manual, such as professional managerial class. It's been opening up rather rapidly up to probably about 2000. After then, the proportion of professional managerial class is kind of stagnated. So that's really a visible change that you observe in the last probably 20 years or so. And that has a tremendous impact, because if the sort of professional managerial class does not open up, then the proportion of people moving into that will not increase, because the pie hasn't grown. So in terms of absolute mobility, the upward mobility into the professional managerial class is kind of held constant in a recent period. So that has that sort of probably the biggest impact in terms of intergenerational mobility, that is, the changing class structure is different. The trend of changing class structure is different. And that is also related to some demographic changes in a society. But that's a little complicated, because it depends on sort of differential fertility rates, right? People from different class background have different fertility rates, then that has impact on it. So it's a little complicated. So it's not a straightforward question, but certainly these changes in class structure or demographic structure have implications for the patterns or the rates that we observe in ability patterns.
Well, this is very, very interesting, and I could keep on going on forever. But but I think we have to close this session. Sure. But before we do that, can I just ask you one final question, which is that had you, would you have chosen to be, if you had not chosen to become a sociologist, what do you think you might have become?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I never thought about it.
You never thought about it?
No, actually not. I'm pretty happy with where I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's an answer too.
Yeah. So if I were to repeat I don't mind repeating the same path because there are so many things that I don't know yet. And there are so many things that I could still do as a sociologist. So I don't know. That was the answer that you're expecting.
No, it's that's actually a very reassuring answer for academics. Okay. So thank you very much indeed for a very interesting insight into your research, and also like telling us quite a lot about how these very important social data are being created, and so on. So we're going to say goodbye today, and we'll be back with I think Professor Sahashi Ryo next time. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.